So here we are on day 71, even if for you in practice this is day 928, it doesn't matter, you've made it to Titus. And again, it's just helpful to know some of the background before we start to read the letters that we're going to be reading this week. So the background of Titus is that Titus is a Gentile, a non-Jew that Paul led to the Lord, and then Titus joined him in his missionary work. So Paul sends him to Corinth twice to help deal with the problems in the church in Corinth. And in the letter that he's writing at the moment, Titus is in Crete. He's been left there to kind of look after some of the new churches there in Crete. And so Paul is kind of giving him instructions and advice about the way that he might go about this. One of the things that apparently Cretans were known for was their low moral standards. And so actually that's talked about in Titus, where Paul quotes one of their own people saying about how kind of greedy they are and lazy they are and stuff like that. And so there's an instruction from Paul really to Titus to say, make sure you show people what it is to live as part of the church and how that's a different moral conduct. And there's a real emphasis in this letter about being good. And so there's instructions on what that means if you're a man and a woman and a slave. But the main thing is that, and also if you're a church leader, but the main thing is that we are to be good, not in order to earn God's grace, but because we've received it. And then the next letter we'll read is the letter to Philemon. This is the shortest letter, just 25 verses. And it's a letter that Paul wrote to a guy called Philemon about a guy called Onesimus. So Onesimus was a slave who Paul had encountered and led to Jesus, and then he's sending him back to Philemon, who happens to be a believer in the church in Colossae. So the guy that carried the letter to the Colossians also carries a letter to Philemon at the same time. And Paul is sending Onesimus back to Philemon, and he's basically, the whole purpose of the letter is to say, can you forgive Onesimus for running away? So in that culture, if a slave ran away, Onesimus was kind of really in trouble. Philemon was within his rights to have him put to death. And Paul is saying to him, actually, I want you to receive him as a brother in Christ and forgive him. He actually says, I'm not going to make you forgive him, but just remember that I led you to Jesus and basically you owe me everything. So how about you think about forgiving him? And then the next letter, the letter to the Hebrews, this is not written by Paul. This is written by somebody we don't know who, but somebody who is writing to we don't know who either. But it seems like a predominantly Jewish community. Some people have speculated maybe the church in Rome. And what we do know is that the community that is being written to were obviously suffering persecution, and they were suffering discouragement, because that's addressed in the content of the letter. And sometimes it's a tricky letter to read, Hebrews, because there's really one overarching argument, there's one case being made and one truth that's being communicated, that being that Jesus is the Son of God and that he surpasses everything that has gone before. So that's the one argument that's being made all the way through. But because in the letter, frequently the argument is interrupted with kind of a period of exhortation or a period of application, sometimes it's hard to follow the train of thought. And also because it obviously was written 2,000 years ago in a whole different world, with a whole different kind of thought pattern, sometimes that makes it a bit tricky to follow as well. So what can be helpful when reading Hebrews is to remember it's being written to a community that's discouraged, and you can put yourself in their shoes. So they were Jews who had believed that Jesus was the Messiah and that their messianic hopes and expectations would be fulfilled when they put their trust in him. But what happened as a result of their belief in him is actually a long period of suffering and a long period of struggle. And so they're probably starting to wonder, maybe, is Jesus the answer in the way that we thought he was? That's one thing to bear in mind when reading it. The second thing to bear in mind is, as I said, the main thing that's being communicated in Hebrews. And that is that Jesus is the beginning and the end of all things. And that he has come and that he has dealt with sin once for all through his suffering on the cross. Also what has happened is because of his suffering, he is able to identify with us in our struggles. And this is one of the things I love about Jesus, that he's not distant, sitting up in heaven, kind of like, with no idea of what it is to be a human being, that he has on his hands and in his feet and in his side scars of the cross. He understands what it is to suffer, and he's empathetic and merciful even as he prays for us, because he knows what we're enduring. And then the final letter that we're going to be reading is the letter to James, is the letter by James. And James is not writing to a specific community. He's writing to the Jews that are spread around who've believed in Jesus. And his letter's a good one to read. It's not loads of kind of teaching about God. It's really practical teaching about how we are to live. And it's just helpful to bear in mind that when we're reading it, although it can be tempting to read it as an individual before God, just minding my behaviour, actually it's written to communities. And so really there's a lot in here about what is it to be a healthy community. And for us just to imbibe that and think about that as we engage in our small groups, as we engage in the life of our churches, as we engage in family life or in even a workplace setting, what is it to be a healthy community? James has got some great teaching on that.